All right, welcome back everyone. This is the 5th episode of Layer by Layer, my Photoshop post-processing tutorial series. Today, I'm going to be going over some advanced reflection techniques by breaking down this shot that you see in front of you. This is a composite nightscape with some little fancy techniques involved here for the reflection in the foreground. So I'll show you first the original shot in Lightroom. This is the foreground shot during blue hour during a backpacking trip through Sequoia National Park. So what we're going to be doing is first dropping a Milky Way over this boring sky here, and then we're going to be reflecting that whole thing onto this lake. And instead of blending through this rock, which is the easy way to do things, we're actually going to go ahead and reflect this rock in the foreground water. This episode is going to be a bit of a doozy, a lot of stuff to go over, so I'm just going to hop right into Photoshop right now. Okay, so first thing you're going to do in Photoshop is just drop the Milky Way over. This sky file should be pretty familiar to you. This is the same sky file that's used for the first 2 episodes of this series, and I'm actually not going to spend any time on this sky drop at all because I've already spent 3 episodes detailing pretty much everything there is to know about Nightscape composites. So there's nothing that interesting left to discuss here. I'm just showing you this because this is the first step in the workflow. What you're going to want to do after you're done with this sky drop, save this file as a TIFF or PSD, and then open it again as a smart object in Photoshop. Okay, so now if you look in the layers panel here, I've opened that last TIFF file as a smart object inside this Photoshop file. And right away, the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and composite the reflection for this foreground water here. So if you saw the last episode, the workflow for this should be pretty familiar. And if you haven't seen the last episode, I highly recommend that you go and watch it. It's pretty short, but this episode does build on all the techniques in there. So we're going to go ahead and duplicate this smart object, and we're going to flip it across the vertical axis. When I turn this layer on, it's going to look like this. Just for demonstration purposes here, I will delete this layer mask that I have on it and add a mask just for the reflective part. If you're lazy, I mean, this is pretty much good enough, right? You can go ahead and follow the workflow in the last episode, and you got yourself a pretty solid shot. For me, on this shot, I want to do something a little bit extra. So in the original file, I really liked how the foreground of the lake had this rock in it. This guy right here. So what I want to do is I want to reflect the background into the water, but I also want to reflect this rock into the foreground. What that's going to entail is us actually layering a reflection of the rock over the reflection for the background mountain and sky. Things are a little tricky because the boundary, the reflection axis of this rock here is not perfectly straight. So we got to do some tricky stuff in order to get the reflection looking natural. Okay, so let's hop right in. First thing you're going to want to do is zoom way into your image here, and with your brush and tablet, you're going to want to cut out the part of the rock that we want to reflect. Then go ahead and add that mask to the shoreline mask that you created for the background reflection. That's going to be a mask that looks like this. Save this mask because we'll need this later. Next, you want to cut out this rock here in the foreground. So we're going to take this layer, this smart object. This is the original smart object from the TIFF that we did the sky drop on. And we're going to just duplicate it. Next, you'll rasterize the layer. So this will turn this layer into a regular layer instead of a smart object. And on this layer here, go ahead and edit this mask. You're going to brush out the entire background so that this layer has only this foreground rock. And in this case, I'm going to do it just by first brushing in a little boundary. I'm going to use my paint bucket tool, fill in black, and then go back to my brush and touch up any areas that need to be touched up. Okay, so now if we look at this layer, turn the background off, it's just this rock. Now we're going to go ahead and apply the layer mask. Then I'm going to reflect this in Edit Transform. I'm going to reflect it vertically to create the reflection for that rock in the foreground. Okay, so now we have the reflection for the rock in the foreground, but it's still got a ways to go. So if I turn on this background layer again, and I go ahead and try and position this reflected rock, you can see no matter how I try to line it up, I get some gaps here in the water. Fixing this is actually pretty simple in practice. It took me a bit of trial and error to figure out the right tool to use for this situation. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to line up the lowermost edge of the rock. So in this case, I've lined up this little tail part of the rock here on the left. Now that we got the lowest part of the rock and its reflection lined up, we're going to go ahead and warp the rest of this rock to match the natural boundary of the original foreground element. So go down to Edit, Puppet Warp, and that's going to open up a triangular grid that looks something like this. Keep the mode at normal, and you can go ahead for this one, change the density to more points. Go over all the way to the right side. Place a point on the rightmost point of the rock and drag that to meet the original non-reflected element. Place another point here on the leftmost edge and drag that to meet the leftmost. So now we've anchored this reflection to the left and right points of the original rock. And now we're just going to zoom in and start placing points and dragging those down to where the boundary of the original rock lies. So we'll put one here, put one here, put one here, and so on and so forth. Take your time with this, be patient, because you want your result to look natural in the end. When you're dragging around the points, one thing to keep in mind is try not to move horizontally too much. Try to just drag the point that you place directly up and down. So we're going to repeat this process all the way to the right edge of the frame, making sure that when you're finally done with it all, there are no gaps between the original foreground rock and the reflection. Okay, so I just fast forwarded through a segment where I freehand placed a couple of control points just to demonstrate to you guys how you would do something like this. In reality, you'd probably use a lot more control points than I did here. I just did something real quick just so I could illustrate the concept to you guys. When you're done placing your control points and lining up the axis of reflection here, try playing around with the mode of the puppet warp between normal, distort, and rigid. In this case, I found that normal looked the best, in my opinion. For this one, how I place the control points, distort is all sorts of crazy, so we're not going to use that. And rigid didn't really have much of a difference compared to normal. Okay, so once you're all done with your puppet warp, you should have an image that looks a little something like this. Drag that layer with the reflected island somewhere above your original reflection layer so that when you turn on your reflection, you get this. So at this point, we've built our reflection. So if I turn off the main layer here in the back, this is the asset that will form our reflection. We're just missing one small thing, and that's the original rock that was in the foreground to match up with the reflection. So go ahead and reduplicate your original smart object, stick it on top of the reflection in this case, and then apply that original mask that we had, which combined the background and the cutout rock. Now I'll turn on the original background layer again, and that'll just fill in some of those transparent spots. At this point, we've created the full reflection for the shot. We've reflected this foreground rock and we reflected the background mountain and sky. Next, we're just going to go ahead and grade this reflection. Darken a little bit for both the original background and sky reflection. And also don't forget to apply another curves or exposure adjustment layer to the foreground rock reflection. One thing you can consider doing, just like we did in the last episode, is instead of using this mask here, you can apply a very slight linear gradient from the bottom of the frame of the main reflection. This will let some of that foreground water texture through and just make the frame a little more believable. For demonstration purposes, I've replaced that mask with the original shoreline mask, and I forgot to save it, of course, in a channel, so that's gone for good until I reload this image. So just imagine that it's there. So at this point, this reflection actually looks pretty decent. But for me, I wanted to take this reflection up a notch just slightly. To me, this water looks just a little too calm. There's absolutely no texture in it whatsoever, and the reflection is just a little too perfect. So add a little blur, and then we'll create a custom displacement mask to simulate some ripples in the water. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to stamp just the working layers that we have for the reflection. So I'll turn off this main layer that I've duplicated above, and then I'll stamp all of these reflection working layers into a single layer. And that's what this layer looks like. There's just some leftover stuff over here from the original background layer, but that's not an issue because all this is going to get masked out anyways. So once we've done that, you can go ahead and convert this to a smart object. The reason we're converting this stamped layer to a smart object is so that we can use smart filters on it and keep track of what blur filters we're applying to it and adjust them after the fact. With this layer converted to a smart filter, we can now go to Filter, Blur. First, we'll add a very slight motion blur. I'm going to turn the angle to 90 degrees so it's vertical. And I'll add maybe a 10 pixel motion blur. Next, I'll add a small Gaussian blur as well. For this image, 3 pixels looks pretty decent. Now that our reflection layer is pretty much ready, we're going to move on and create a custom displacement mask to simulate some ripples in this foreground water. We're going to start by creating a new Photoshop file. You're going to set the dimensions of this file to match the dimensions of your original shot. In this case, I'll just use 4000 by 6000 pixels. Set the background to white and create the file. Go and unlock that background layer. Go to Filter, Noise, Add Noise. Going to crank the amount all the way to 400%. Check monochromatic and change the distribution to Gaussian. Click OK. Now that we have our noised image, what we're going to do is we're going to manipulate the red and green channels independently in order to create a displacement mask that will simulate the texture of water. For this step, I'm just going to go ahead and recite to you and demonstrate the steps involved. If you want to actually understand what all these steps are doing, there's a really great tutorial online about how to create this displacement mask that I basically took this straight from, and that will also explain exactly what it is that you're doing. So if you are curious about the underlying mechanics, I will link that in the description for you, and I highly recommend that you give it a read. Just takes about 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, so let's start with the red channel. You're going to go to Filter, Stylize, Emboss. We're going to emboss it at 180 degrees, a height of 1 pixel. We're going to crank the amount to 500%. Next, on the green channel, we're going to do the same thing. Filter, Stylize, Emboss, except we're going to change the angle to 90 degrees. Now, we'll just take a look at the image. And you can see the red and green channels are slightly offset from each other. At this point, we want to warp this to mimic the perspective of looking at water straight on. So we'll go to Edit, Perspective Warp. Let's close that help dialog. So we're going to select the original image. And we'll warp it by dragging the corners all the way out like this. Once you got something that looks like this, make sure you fill in the transparent parts. Go and apply that perspective warp. Okay, then we're going to do the exact same thing once more. So edit, perspective warp. Okay, at this point, your displacement mask looks something like this. You can already see where the ripples are supposed to be. Just 2 quick steps left. First, enter Quick Mask by pressing Q on your keyboard. Select your gradient tool, a linear gradient from white to black. You're going to drag this linear gradient from the top of the image down to the bottom. Press Q to exit Quick Mask and turn that into a selection. Select the red channel and set your background color to 7F, 7F, 7F. That's 50% neutral gray. Then with the red channel still selected and the selection active, press Command or Control and backspace. And that's going to fill that selection with neutral gray on the red channel. Now you can deselect the selection and go back to your original displacement mask, the RGB channel. I'm going to do something similar for the green channel. So enter Quick Mask again. And this time we're just going to select just the very top of this displacement mask here. So I'm going to drop a gradient. It looks something like this. Exit Quick Mask. Select the green channel and fill it with the same neutral gray. And at this point, we're all done with our displacement mask. Okay, so now we're back in the original Photoshop file. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this stamped reflection layer. I'm going to rasterize it as well. Select the part of this rasterized layer, which is only the reflection part of the image. In this case, that's this shoreline mask that I created originally to support the reflection, just inverted. With the selection active, go to Filter, Distort, Displace. You'll be prompted for a horizontal scale and vertical scale. To start off, you can set these to 50 and 50, we'll say. Stretch to fit and repeat edge pixels is fine. When you click OK, you'll be prompted to open up a displacement mask file. Select that displacement mask PSD that you created in a step before. Now, as you can see, our displacement mask has created ripples in this foreground water here. If you think the effect is too strong or not strong enough, you can undo that displacement mask and just reapply it with different parameters for the horizontal and vertical scale. Play around with the scale and find an effect that you like. And once you do, you're pretty much done with this reflection. Another finishing touch you can add is to mask out the ripples towards the bottom of the frame. That's just a stylistic choice that's up to you. At this point, we're all done with reflection. We've blurred it, we've displaced it, and now we can finally turn back on our original background layer. From here on, it's just a standard post-processing workflow. Contrast, dodging and burning, star minimization for the Milky Way, some light bleed, some more light bleed, even more light bleed, and then finally, just a little bit of contrast on the mountains here in the background. And that pretty much wraps up this tutorial. I know I really sped through the end there. I didn't really want to focus on the standard post-processing techniques since I think I've covered them enough in the last 4 episodes. This episode, I really wanted to focus on some more advanced reflection techniques, such as what we did with this foreground rock here and the displacement mask. At this point, you're pretty much ready to drop a reflection into whatever shot you want. You can kind of go crazy with it. There are a lot of really awesome creative opportunities with this that you can experiment with. If you're still a little confused about that displacement mask technique, or you have some questions, this is a technique that you can widely find on the internet. You can Google for something like Photoshop displacement mask water, and that will give you a whole bunch of different videos and articles and tutorials about how to create these displacement masks. Okay, so I hope everyone enjoyed this episode. You learned a little something from it, and I hope you will take these techniques and experiment with them on your own shots. I'll be back in another 2 or 3 weeks with an episode about dropping a sunset sky and matching colors in the foreground.